I'm very happy to be able to present this award to Eric Foner, who is a personal inspiration, as he has been for so many of us in this room. As I was thinking about what to say in presenting this, I decided that I would do something I'm going to call Encounters with Foner. I first encountered Eric Foner by way of his work, and this was presented to me in my freshman year at Howard University. See, this is the thing. If you are a Howard person, you are compelled to say that whenever someone mentions the word Howard. It's kind of like a drinking game with no booze involved. Well, the closest analogy I can say is the way that if you say Brooklyn is an involuntary reflex where Brooklyn people have to, Brooklyn, you know, that thing? So Howard people are like this as well. But my first year at Howard, a historian by the name of Adele Patton taught a course called Black Diaspora, which met on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 11 a.m. And on the syllabus was a book called Nothing But Freedom. And we read that toward the end of the semester. And in this slim volume, I was introduced to Eric Foner's work, and he had, with an enviable level of economy, looked comparatively at the post-emancipation regimes and fortunes of Black people in the American South, in South Africa, in Haiti, and in the British Caribbean, and made the assessment of what the relationship of these people had been to the labor and to the economy of the societies in which they had become tenuously free. And this set my curiosity ablaze, and as with most valuable work, raised far more questions that I was interested in pursuing than even the voluminous answers that were contained in this book. My second encounter was actually a personal one I'm certain he does not recall, but has had an indelible impact upon my life. In 1994, as I was applying to graduate schools, I had come down to two programs that I was interested in, two PhD programs in history, one at Columbia and one at Rutgers University. And in the course of doing my due diligence, I popped up to Columbia. I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, and someone in the department kind of went through the schedule and said, oh, Professor Foner is teaching a class now. Why don't you go in and sit down? And so I walked into this classroom, I sat in the very back, and I remember the lecture that he gave so well, I could practically give it myself. Well, no, okay, I have given that lecture myself. But he was teaching about Antietam, and he set this moment in such a way that we understood all that was at stake, the consequences, the way that Abraham Lincoln, in dialogue with Horace Greeley, had decided that an Emancipation Proclamation couldn't be issued until after the North had won a significant victory. And so time goes and they bide their time until the fortuitous turn of events and the happenstance that lead to General McClellan's victory at Antietam in the bloodiest day of the entire war, and 22,000 people die. And in the course of this, it paves the way for the release of the Emancipation Proclamation. And all of these varying dynamics that are cantilevered and hung in the air come together in this one moment. And at the conclusion of this lecture, he pointed out that the Harlem Renaissance novelist, Dorothy West, who was then still alive, she was 95 years old or so, and it was like, some of you have noticed that there was a kind of recognition of her, a re-emergence of her work, in her later years, and he said, it's important to recall not simply what she did and that she's the last remaining novelist of the Harlem Renaissance, but that Dorothy West's father was a slave. And in simply making that point, established far better than any set of data or statistics or a dry recitation of facts, the immediacy of the issues that we had seen discussed with such amazing clarity in the classroom. I sold out and went to Rutgers anyway. But that remained a benchmark to me in the conveying of historical knowledge. My third encounter was again with his work, in which, as a graduate student at Rutgers, we read, in my 19th century seminar, we read his work on Reconstruction. And the week in which we discussed that book, what stood out to me was that of our seminar, which was 12 or 14 people had delved deeply into this book, and we had all found separate things that we found were the most salient points that we needed to examine, that we needed to discuss in this. And if we're looking for, we could say the same thing about the multiple connections in his work, and the themes in his work, but we could easily find the prominence of working people, the relationship of people to labor and the economy and the societies in which they live, and their noble, continuous struggle to achieve a more dignified and equal footing in the society that they live in. My fourth encounter with Eric Foner has been, oddly enough, as a neighbor. In some weird twist of the universe, I wound up with Eric Foner as my upstairs neighbor, which has been a mostly good situation. But I have to tell you, the noise complaints, you would never know from this guy. The wild parties, the historians drunkenly brawling in the hallway over pitched battles about historiography and interpretations of the populist movement. It has been something to put up with. But despite all this, I'm deeply honored to present to a mentor and inspiration and a neighbor, Professor Eric Foner, the Saul Stetin Award for 2022.
Those of you who don't know Jelani personally may not realize that he is the proud father of a wonderful little girl who I think is probably around 5 now, and 2 younger twins. So when it comes to noise complaints, I'll match the noise that we produce in our apartment to what those wonderful, beautiful children produce in our hallway. I'm very grateful to the Sidney Hillman Foundation for this award. It's really an honor, and I'm very pleased to receive it. I have to admit that I was surprised at first when notified about it, because I've never thought of myself as a labor historian in the way the academic world defines this field. But thinking about it, I realized that the labor movement and the lived experience of ordinary working people, especially slaves and their descendants, has been central to my career as a historian. I grew up, as you saw, in a labor household. My Uncle Henry Foner, for many years, headed the Fur and Leather Workers Union. My Uncle Mo Foner was a key figure in 1199, the Drug and Hospital Workers Union. Uncle Phil was one of the country's most prolific labor historians. And my father, Jack, also a historian, but studied the history of African Americans. And when the Foner family is introduced that way, sometimes, unfortunately, my mother gets left out in the cold. She was an artist and a high school teacher and also an activist in the teachers' union back in the late 1940s, et cetera. So in other words, my family was closely connected to the labor movement, and my parents instilled in me the conviction that no account of American history can be considered adequate without making the history of labor a central part of the story. Now, it is true, when I was in graduate school, college graduate school in the 1960s at Columbia University, the study of labor was pretty much neglected, I'd have to say, in the curriculum there. What was emphasized at Columbia was political history, intellectual history, often done brilliantly, for example, by my own mentor, Richard Hofstadter. But it was only, in a sense, after I got my PhD that I began to re-educate myself by paying more attention to the history of labor. I was among those who was very influenced by a whole generation of historians who were rewriting the history of labor in the Atlantic world, really, and had expanded the definition of labor history to encompass workers' entire lives, not just the history of trade unions, which have, although indispensable to our democracy, have never actually represented a majority of the working class. I'm talking about people like Eric Hobsbawm and E.P. Thompson in England, David Montgomery, Herbert Gutman. All of them influenced me enormously and really provided a second education in which the history of labor was much more central than in my earlier education. But my scholarship, as you heard from Jelani, has mostly focused on Reconstruction, the era that followed the Civil War, and one of the most misunderstood periods of American history, but ultra relevant to the current moment that we are living in. And I'm grateful for this award because, in part, because it recognizes that the experience of slavery, emancipation, and Reconstruction is part of the history of American labor. Because the key question of Reconstruction was what kind of labor system would replace the shattered system of slavery, and whether the former slaves would enjoy the same rights and opportunities as free white workers did. And pursuing that question, I came under the influence of another powerful figure, the great W.E.B. Du Bois, and his great book, Black Reconstruction in America, published in 1935. Du Bois's title, Black Reconstruction, emphasized the centrality of the black experience to the whole Civil War era. He pointed out things that today are taken for granted, but back then were really highly original, such as the centrality of slavery to American development, political development, economic development, or I should say that those ideas were taken now central to the way history is taught, but I should say, except in Florida and a few other places where it's become illegal to emphasize that slavery was central to American history. But Du Bois, one of his key themes is that African Americans were not only freed men and freed women, but a central part of the American working class, a point he drives home by entitling the first chapter of that book, not the slave, but the black worker. He wants you to think about the emancipated slaves as a part of the working class, not simply as former slaves. But more than this, Du Bois emphasized that the experience of black labor during Reconstruction is intimately tied to the history of American democracy. Reconstruction, among other things, was an effort for the first time in American history to make this a truly interracial democracy. For the first time in our history, large numbers of African American men were able to hold public office. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans voted for the first time, and a functioning multiracial democracy was created. Now, of course, in an outcome that unfortunately echoes all the way down to the present, those efforts were eventually turned back, and Reconstruction did not succeed. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that to write black political history, as I did, therefore, is to write labor history, even when it's not called that. And to discuss black struggle for equality is to discuss emancipated slaves as political agents who charted a path toward a better future for this country. I'm not trying to boost my royalties here, but I do urge you to try to come to think about the history of Reconstruction, particularly in light of the current moment that we are living in. Back in the 1890s, so right before, a couple of years before his death, Frederick Douglass gave a speech in which he said, accomplishments that we have taken for granted and thought were permanent are now being challenged and overthrown. The experience of that generation of a tremendous leap forward in democracy and then a backlash over the next generation, which wiped away much of what was accomplished, we do need to look at how people responded to those events, because we are seeing echoes of them today. But anyway, in my teaching and writing, I've always emphasized that it's impossible to imagine progressive change in this country without a revitalization of the labor movement. And if history teaches any lessons, that is surely one. So thank you very much.